It takes many cogs for a clock to turn. Any tech is rendered unusable unless there are many smaller pieces present for it to function. A cart would be useless to carry material if it weren't for the wheels underneath it to smoothly roll through any terrain. A car would be an expensive hunk of metal if not for the spark plugs delivering an electric charge compelling the air-fuel mixture within the engine's combustion chambers to ignite for the vehicle to run. A firearm would be nothing more than a fancy club if not for the firing pin making contact with the cartridge, igniting the gunpowder inside to create enough gas pressure to push the bullet out through the barrel, hitting the target after pulling its trigger. For an object to fulfill its purpose, the pieces inside must work together to achieve the desired outcome. In some circumstances, an object may have multiple uses. Even rarer, an object may leap over tall buildings with a single bound to transcend its intended purpose. Which poses the question, what if the gun has a soul? It's a question Brad Bird poses in his 1999 directorial debut of The Iron Giant. Using the similarly titled novel by British poet laureate Ted Hughes as a base for the narrative, the story follows a 9-year-old Hogarth Hughes making friends with a giant metal man after it lands in the coast of Maine during the 10th year of the Cold War. While the movie criticizes the fears of foreign influences, more specifically Red Scare hysteria, it centers its focus on the fact that the thing is more than the sum of its parts.
While you're snoozing in your wooded jammies, back in Washington, we're wide awake and worried.
To say the United States and the USSR are different entities would be a gross understatement. One is a democratically represented constitutional republic, the other was a totalitarian single-party state. One's economic system and philosophy prioritizes private property and the production of goods being the responsibility of the private sector, the other believes the means of production belongs to the people and should be facilitated by the government through planning their economy. One still lives on as the world's largest economy, and the other dissolved over 30 years ago because of political and economic instability. The only thing the two nations had in common was their hatred for one another. The United States were fearful of Soviet influence around the world, more specifically if it were to ever encroach on the democratic nations in Western Europe post-World War II, which is why Uncle Sam decided to implement a few things to stave off the popularity of communism. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe and placed those countries under America's sphere of influence. The Truman Doctrine gave support to democratic nations overwhelmed with authoritarian pressures from inside or outside their borders. And along with most of Western Europe and Canada, the US created NATO for the main purpose of deterring the Soviets from going on the offensive. The thought of a diametrically opposed nation with potentially enough strength to challenge US global dominance put the capital state in a bind. Either allow communism to spread or do everything to minimize its presence. Keeping the historical context in mind, meet Kent Mansley, personnel of the United States government in the Bureau of Unexplained Phenomena. He's presented to the audience as a pompous representative conducting what he believes to be a wasteful investigation at the power station.
No, Marv. Big things happen in big places. And the sooner I fill out my report, the sooner I can get back to them.
Mansley fixes his tune once he sees half his car gone with bite marks left behind, with his feelings changing from dismissiveness to bewildered horror, and diligently continues the investigation. Agent Mansley represents all the fears, insecurities, and concerns the White House had of foreign influences during the time. Though his original tone is still condescending, he expresses this by describing himself as the government's response to any phenomenon that can't be explained cogently. He expounds on this idea further when he and Hogarth go into town for ice cream as they discuss the Soviets' launching of Sputnik. Hogarth's interest is contrasted with Mansley's skepticism, saying,
Foreign satellite, Hogarth, and all that implies. Even now, it orbits overhead. Boop, boop, watching us. We can't see it, but it's there. Much like that giant thing in the woods. We don't know what it is or what it can do. I don't feel safe, Hogarth. Do you?
Equating the giant with the Soviet Sputnik, he projects these insecurities onto the young protagonist, demanding the boy dispense any information he has so the government can
destroy it before it destroys us!
Some will say the actions Agent Mansley takes from badgering Hogarth with endless questions.
Now, why would you tell your mom about a giant robot? Slugger, try what you see at the power station. Huh, Tiger? Did you tell anyone else about this, buddy? Hey, how big is this thing, Ranger? Been in the forest lately, Scout? Hey, where you go?
Browbeating the kid from the mentioned example and going as far as threatening to separate the boy from his mother is a disgusting overreach of boundaries and infringes on the main character's constitutional rights. It's a true statement, but it's not too far from the actions the US government took to curb domestic communist sympathies. 19 years before the story begins, the House Un-American Activities Committee oversaw probing everyone, from the average Joe to US government officials suspicious of having any associations with communists. Having that additional context, Mansley's actions make sense. He sees Hogarth as a traitorous hooligan concealing vital knowledge that could make or break US national security. But for all the bluster of keeping the American people safe on his watch, he's a glory-bereft weakling trying to vindicate himself. When Mansley stops by the Hughes' residence to use the phone, he calls General Hogarth to relay what he saw but lacks sufficient evidence for further action. After weathering the storm of his superior's laughter, Mansley declares ensures he'll get the evidence.
And when I do, I'm gonna want a memo distributed.
That sounds swell,
To solidify his accomplishment and prove that he's not crazy, like he once believed the power station foreman to be or the fisherman who originally called in the tip. To work or collaborate with the US government, some degree of courage and honor must be present, especially if a person collaborates with the military. Kent Mansley is all but those two traits. When Dean relays the giant is reactive and has Hogarth in hand, what he relays to the general is different.
He says the monster's killed a kid. Sir, we must stop it at all costs.
Two things happened here. One, this is Mansley's ego. Because he spent so much time investigating this case, he's completely compromised, incapable of making choices that don't propel the glory he gets from taking down what he sees as foreign interference. And two, Hogarth has been an utter nuisance who constantly obstructed his investigation. So he'd rather be rid of that child, and if he can use the giant as a false flag, so be it. But both the saber-rattling and spinelessness come to a head when Kent snatches the general's walkie-talkie, ordering the Nautilus to fire the nuke despite the giant presenting as non-threatening.
The missile now!
And with the realization that the missile he ordered to fire will hit the town, he tries running away but is immediately stopped and detained. Although the power agent Mansley held as a government official during a time where foreign influence was a top concern gives context to his actions throughout the narrative, unfortunately his personal ambition and that same power limited him from rising to the occasion like a good soldier.
Come on, Mom, it's me, remember?
The life of a child can be difficult. Having to balance educational duties, taking care of assigned chores, making sure one is emotionally regulated well enough to properly socialize with others, whether they be kids or adults, is a challenging task. Most can excel at one of these skills, fewer can excel at two, but trying to max out all three is a tall order to ask from anyone, and that's assuming both parents are present. Now imagine being a child with no father in the picture. A mother, although she is loving and caring, must consistently work late nights, and that child, despite being extremely intelligent relative to his age, has trouble socializing with his peers and can barely conceptualize undertaking responsibilities because he also has a penchant for committing mischievous and disobedient acts. With that out of the way, meet Hogarth Hughes, the main protagonist of the film. Although he is characterized as a smart kid, he has an issue with understanding the full ramifications of his choices. When Hogarth is first introduced, he stops at the diner trying to introduce his mother Annie to his new friend, a squirrel. She instantly rejects having any pets in the house because of pressures to run out of the room to make ends meet.
And no one wants to live in a place with shredded upholstery.
You'll never.
She gives additional insight as to how his sympathies for an animal trapped in a cage gets the best of him, recalling the time he had a pet raccoon.
The raccoon, Hogarth. Ugh, I remember the raccoon.
Because he can retrieve the squirrel after it escapes and crawls up Dean's leg, who then releases it from captivity, as a result, the creature wreaks havoc throughout the diner, proving her point that he isn't responsible enough if he can't keep his critters in check. This character trait is also highlighted when his mother calls informing him she'll be working late and telling him what to eat, when to go to bed, and what not to watch. Unsurprisingly, he disregards all three of those commands. Well, because he's a child. Just because Hogarth has a defiant streak doesn't mean he is without morals. When he follows the trail of destruction leading to the town's power station, he finds the titular iron giant devouring the metal around, until it gets tangled in between power lines, electrocuting it. Hogarth begins to retreat, but he just can't help but sympathize and free the trapped giant. And because he saved the giant, he earned a friend. Or since the creature sustained an earlier cranial injury, became the human guardian responsible for its care and upkeep. A pet owner. A title his mother believes he can't live up to. Still, she's proven correct when he formally meets the giant on the next day. A, he couldn't keep it from following him back home, and B, couldn't stop it from fully fixing the track it ripped from the ground being on the business end of an oncoming train. But Hogarth's primary purpose in the story is to serve as the compass where the giant can derive its morality. He introduces it to Action Comics number 188, laying out the similarities between it and the Man of Steel, and imprints on it the idea of living as a being of goodness and reinforces it.
This guy is Superman. Sure, he's famous now, but he started off just like you. Crash landed on Earth, didn't know what he was doing, but he only uses his powers for good, never for evil.
Outside of instilling positive values onto the Metal Man, Hogarth puts his newly found sense of responsibility to use when it comes to caring for the creature. He keeps the giant's hand out of sight, convinces Dean to house and feed it since he doesn't have the appropriate space. Even when Hogarth had to disclose its location to guarantee he and his mom stay together, he was still able to call Dean to throw a Hail Mary by turning the giant into an art piece to throw off the troops. But what elevates the sense of responsibility to dutiful bravery is how he talks the giant down from his rampage. The army tried throwing everything they've got to no effect. His mom and Dean are trying to get him to the hospital, and without missing a beat, he dashes through the battlefield, wagering the giant he first met is still there despite his chance of dying. Lo and behold, the giant is receptive. What he lacks because of his childish antics, he makes up with his ironclad will.
I am not a gun.
People fear what they don't understand. Though this is a tired expression, there's a reason why it's constantly uttered. People have a natural aversion to objects or concepts they can't fathom. From the fears of foreign influences explained in the first body paragraph to the massive heart attack Orson Welles gave to the American public with his 1938 radio adaptation of The War of the Worlds. When it comes to something new, the defenses will instantly activate. Now meet the titular character of the film, the Iron Giant, a being of few words that crash landed on Earth one stormy night. When we are first introduced to the character, he's nothing more than a force of nature. The giant is mistaken for a lighthouse, causing a fisherman to crash his boat and leaves behind a trail of destruction for Hogarth, who ultimately finds the creature at the power station. Because the giant sustained a head injury from his landing, it's effectively the blank slate walking. No penchant for maliciously causing damage, no desire to destroy the world, just a hungry fish out of water. With being a blank slate, anything can be drawn, and seeing that the first positive interaction the giant experienced so far was with a kid that saved his life, well, why not have that same kid paint on the canvas? So Hogarth becomes a friend and mentor of sorts to the metal behemoth, from teaching it basic word-object association skills, to explaining higher concepts like having a soul. But the most important piece of information that's imparted to it is the comic book character Superman. Before going any further in the essay, a few things must be discussed, starting with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow was an American psychologist who developed the idea of the hierarchy of needs. There are 5 levels, from the most fundamental needs such as obtaining food and shelter to rising through each rank and going beyond to eventually achieve self-actualization. From the model's perspective, people are compelled to prioritize their physical needs before moving on to the next step in the hierarchy. The giant is effectively homeless and hungry, which is why we see random bites out of things throughout town. However, as the narrative develops, he's able to find food, shelter, and safety thanks to his friend Hogarth. 3 out of 5 needs on the hierarchy have been satisfied, but what's with the final 2? For that, let's focus attention on the Man of Steel. Gracing the front page of Action Comics on April 18, 1938, Superman is an American icon. Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. Superman is the ideal character for everyday citizens to model themselves after. He uses his powers to aid mankind, dedicating his life to champion the oppressed and help those in need. A frame of reference the giant can live up to. However, living up to a particular aspiration is a tall order, especially when one believes what they are holds them back from attaining it. In the giant's nightmare sequence, he remembers the purpose of his existence, to be a planet buster. The giant is haunted by this disturbing dream, triggered by an adverse reaction to the dead deer along with identifying the hunting rifle as the lethal weapon. This, plus the dream and briefly identifying with the other comic character Atamo, shoves the giant into an existential crisis. By and large, it's peaceful, but something within its programming compels it to identify and eliminate proactive threats. Whenever the giant and Hogarth play pretend at the scrapyard, the giant defies its friend's call for Atamo and immediately attaches an S on its chest, preferring to be called Superman. However, once Hogarth aims his toy gun at the giant, it responds to the perceived threat, firing a laser out of self-defense. When it regains awareness and is directed by Dean to bear witness to its destruction, the giant leaves, incapable of taking in the sight. For the giant at this moment, it might as well just be called Atamo since becoming Superman is out of reach, indicated by the S once on its chest now on the ground. However, once something is learned, it's hard to forget. Its new sense of morality compels it to save 2 kids dangling from a building, which automatically wins the town's praise, meaning there is still hope. Unfortunately, the military aren't so happy to see the giant, so they throw everything they have at it until it hits the ground while Hogarth is in his hand. Under the impression Hogarth met his demise, the giant blows its top and retaliates against the armed forces. It may be considered out of character for the giant to respond so drastically, but when assessing what happened, it still tracks with the giant's characterization up to this point. After identifying the FU-756 as a weapon just like the hunting rifle, the giant had an opportunity to shoot it down, but it didn't. If a fighter jet is equated to a rifle in purpose, and the gun's purpose is to kill, and the act of killing is bad, then it makes sense for the giant to refrain from taking that shot lest it makes a hypocrite out of itself and its moral framework. Also, even when it goes on the offensive, it only does because A, the direct actions from the military cause Hogarth's death, and B, it suggested there may be a branching path to the giant's moral framework. If one does kill, then there must be some level of reprisal, and that reprisal should be equal in outcome, which is why the giant reacts the way it does in fighting back against the armed forces. It reverted to its nature to neutralize the morally indefensible, but it must be repeated. Once something is learned, it's hard to forget. When the giant still wreaking havoc on the military sees Hogarth is still alive, it gives pause for thought, but not enough to break its programming. That's when Hogarth repeats the mantra,
It's bad to kill. Guns kill. And you don't have to be a gun. You are what you choose to be.
that compels the Iron Giant to reconsider its options. Either continue the path of devastation, proving the military's perspective right, that it's a weapon to be feared, or return to following its moral compass and prove to everyone the contrary. So the Giant chooses option 2 as it reverts to its regular form. But the true test begins when Mansley commands the Nautilus to fire the missile directed at the Giant, which is in town, meaning the government official has guaranteed everyone's death. As the missile is only moments away, the Giant decides to forfeit its life to save the town, placing the final piece on the top of the hierarchy of needs, as he refers to himself as
Superman.
While most things or people have a single intended purpose, it is possible to outgrow or even transcend it. Agent Mansley was nothing more than a government stooge whose hunger for glory and fear motivated his actions to subdue the Giant no matter what. Hogarth, despite his childishness, was able to be a more responsible kid, especially when caring for the metal visitor. While the Iron Giant's experience on Earth was turbulent, it went beyond being a gun to becoming the Man of Steel. No one is made of steel, but one's resolve should be as strong as the alloy. But hey, what do I know? Thank you for watching the video. Give us a like and subscribe to the channel for more content. Click on the bell to be notified on future uploads. Share the video around the internet, and again, thank you for watching. I'll see you on the next one.